Greetings, true believers. This is our video lecture on the causes of the Civil War. In this lecture, you're going to learn about how disagreements on mainly slavery led to the sectional conflict that is now known as the American Civil War. By the end of this lecture, you need to be able to explain the causes of the Civil War, describe a lot of different terms: the Missouri Compromise, California Statehood, the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, the Dred Scott decision, the KansasNebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the raid on Harper's Ferry, the presidential election of 1860, and Southern Secession. Finally, you need to be able to look at a map and identify the division of Confederate Union states, border states, and the western territories of the United States at the outbreak of the Civil War. So, to look at this sectional conflict that develops, we need to go back to really the first compromise that we learned about regarding slavery. And slavery is really at the center of this conflict. The first one of those is the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Now, we learned in class that when the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory, there was a dispute over what to do about slavery in that territory, and it was settled with the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise added Missouri as a slave state, and the big concern at the time was that Missouri was going to unbalance the Senate in terms of slave and free states, so Maine was added to balance out Missouri. And then a compromise line was established at the southern border of Missouri. Any new states north of that line would have been free states. Any new states south of that line would have been slave states. The problem is that the United States is going to acquire all of this territory from Mexico, and the line doesn't extend into that territory. So it creates a new dispute. Is this area going to allow slavery? Is it not going to allow slavery? So Congress is going to need a way to settle this issue with all of this new land that they've acquired from beating up on Mexico. The situation is going to be further exacerbated by California. And what's going to happen in California in 1849? It's still a territory of the United States, recently acquired from Mexico. Gold is going to be discovered in California, and when gold is discovered in California in 1849, it's going to set off a huge population rush to California. And almost 80,000 gold seekers are going to arrive mainly in Northern California over the course of 1 year, which is more than enough people for it to apply for statehood. So California is going to draft a constitution. They're going to apply for statehood as a free state. The problem is that the Senate is balanced, and by admitting California as a free state, it's going to unbalance the Senate in favor of the free states. That's going to make the southern states really angry, and they're not going to want to let them in. So the question becomes how to admit California to the United States and still keep the slave states happy. In order to figure out a solution to this problem, Henry Clay, the man who developed the Compromise of 1820, who ran for president all those times and always lost, he's going to come out of retirement to help craft a compromise. So he's going to get elected into the Senate, and he's going to try and figure out a way to mend the fences between the northern and southern states, and he's going to help develop a set of laws that are going to replace the Missouri Compromise. This set of laws is going to be known as the Compromise of 1850. So these are the terms of the Compromise of 1850. First, it's going to admit California as a free state. Next is it's going to establish what's called popular sovereignty in the new territories that were acquired from Mexico. And what popular sovereignty is when people in the territory would vote on whether or not they were going to have slavery in that territory. So if we back up and we look at this map on the previous slide, the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory, this is all the land that's left over that was seized from Mexico. Under the Compromise of 1850, these two territories are going to have votes to determine whether they're going to have slavery or not. Third part is that the interstate slave trade is going to be outlawed in the District of Columbia. That means you could still own slaves in the capital, the nation's capital, but you weren't allowed to buy and sell slaves. Texas is going to settle its border dispute with New Mexico. New Mexico is going to get some land from Texas, but in exchange, the federal government is going to agree to pay off a big chunk of Texas's debt that they have. And the final and probably the most divisive issue in this compromise is going to be the inclusion of a much stronger Fugitive Slave Act. And it's this Fugitive Slave Act that's going to cause a lot of anger and bitterness in the free states. But what the Fugitive Slave Act does is it makes it a crime to assist any slave in escaping throughout the country. It means escaped slaves, they can be arrested in free states and then returned to slave states. So really it means that there's no safe spot for anybody who's a slave. And it's a little worse than that because the system, it heavily favors the southern states. These slave commissioners were appointed kind of to act as judges in these cases and to rule on whether or not people who were captured by federal marshals or bounty hunters were actually fugitive slaves or not. But the problem with the system is these slave commissioners, they got paid more to rule somebody was a slave than to rule that they were a free person. So there's a lot of corruption in the system, and lots of people who weren't even fugitive slaves get put into bondage because of this system. So the next big problem that's going to pop up after the Fugitive Slave Act is going to be the issue of statehood for Kansas and Nebraska. So Kansas and Nebraska by the mid-1850s, they want statehood. These are the last big chunks of territory from the Louisiana Purchase, right here. Now, we're going to see the introduction of a very powerful senator from Illinois named Stephen Douglas. And under the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, this would have been land that was free from slavery. But Stephen Douglas wants to, and he's from Illinois, right here, and he realizes that sooner or later there's going to be a transcontinental railroad that's built to California. And he realizes that if he can get the support of Nebraska and make it a free state, and he can help kind of prompt that railroad being built through the north. So he kind of comes up with this idea of popular sovereignty. This is going to upset abolitionists because if they allow a vote in these areas on slavery, that means that slavery can now expand into areas where it was previously prohibited under the Compromise of 1820. So this is not limiting slavery at all. It's actually providing a way for slavery to expand. Now, Douglas does this because he wants to secure the assistance of Southern senators for his proposals, like his railroad. So to him, it's a way to compromise and buy himself some support from the slave states. But it's going to make the abolitionists who are in the North really angry because of this way it could expand slavery into new areas. This is all going to really come to a head in Kansas. Most of the people who were living in Kansas at the time were against slavery, but there are a lot of slave owners from Missouri who were moving into Kansas, and they wanted to keep their slaves. Fighting is going to break out between these two groups, and you're going to have a small-scale civil war that's fought in Kansas that historians call Bleeding Kansas. There's a couple of important events that I want you to know. Some of them happen in the state of Kansas. Another one happens in Congress over this issue. So one is the sack of Lawrence. The city of Lawrence, Kansas, was kind of the stronghold of the free slavery people. And it's fairly close to the border of Missouri. So people from Missouri that are known as border ruffians, a ruffian is somebody who's a criminal, who causes trouble, who's, rough, so to speak. They're going to march across the border and they're going to sack this city and destroy the city. They don't actually kill anybody, but they burn a lot of buildings, destroy a lot of property. Right about the same time, there's a very grim and violent abolitionist from Ohio who's moved into Kansas to basically, in his mind, right some wrongs and end slavery. His name is John Brown. This is a photograph of John Brown about this time. he decides he wants to get some payback for this sack of Lawrence. So he and some of his followers, including 4 of his sons, they're going to sneak out in the middle of the night and engage in what historians have called the Potawatomi Massacre of 1856. They're going to go into the homes of slave owners who live along the Potawatomi Creek. They're going to bring the men out, and in front of their families, they're going to hack them to pieces with artillery broadswords that look like this. Very violent. You've also got violence that occurs actually in Congress, and you've got an incident where there's an anti-slavery senator named Charles Sumner who's giving a speech, and in the speech he's challenging another senator from South Carolina who's pro-slavery. And he makes a reference to this senator from South Carolina being in bed with the mistress of slavery, so to speak. And the guy who is the senator from South Carolina, his cousin is in the House of Representatives. He's a guy named Preston Brooks, also from South Carolina. And he's going to hear about this, and he's going to consider it a grave insult of his cousin. And he's going to attack Senator Sumner with his walking stick, and he's going to beat him to unconsciousness in the middle of the Senate chamber. And this is going to be met with cheers by the slavery people and horror by the anti-slavery people in the Senate chamber. So this gives you an idea of how heated everything is. When one member of Congress attacks another member of Congress and beats him to unconsciousness in the middle of the chamber. When Brooks returns to South Carolina, they throw a parade in his honor. They send him new engraved walking sticks and suggest that he should put them to good use when he returns to Congress. Sumner ends up having to take 3 years off from the Senate. Massachusetts leaves his seat open and empty so that it's kind of an ongoing symbol of what had happened. But this gives you an idea of how heated everything is at this point. So amidst all this turmoil that's going on in Kansas, you've got a Supreme Court case that's going to make everything even worse. That's the case of Scott versus Sanford in 1857. Now, Dred Scott was a slave. That's him on the left. And his owner, John Sanford, the guy on the right, he repeatedly takes him over the course of his life into free states like Illinois, and I think also the territory of Wisconsin. And when he returns to Missouri, where Sanford's from, Scott sues his owner in court, stating that he should be a free man because he was taken into a free state. And if there's no slavery in those free states, then he himself should be free. The Supreme Court is going to end up taking this case, and they're going to issue a very pro-slavery ruling. Most of the justices on the court at the time were from slave states. And in this ruling, they are going to go above and beyond in trying to protect slavery as an institution. In the ruling, they're going to say that slaves are property and not citizens. Because of this, they have no access to the court system. The court system doesn't exist for their purposes. They're also going to go a little further, and they're going to say no one of African ancestry can ever be a United States citizen. It doesn't matter whether they're free or slave or whatever. If they have African ancestry, no citizenship. Finally, they're going to basically throw out the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and every other law that the Senate and the House of Representatives have passed regarding slavery, and they're going to say that Congress has no power to limit the expansion of slavery. Basically, this boils down to slavery would be legal everywhere, whether a state had made it illegal or not. This is going to effectively eliminate Congress's power to control the spread of slavery. The northern states, the free states, are going to be furious over this decision. Amidst all of this in 1859, John Brown, the orchestrator of the Potawatomi Massacre, has got some grander plans, and he's not deterred from his mission of trying to end slavery forever. He wants to start a widespread slave revolt throughout the South. His grand plan is to seize a weapons arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Arsenal is a place where the military keeps weapons. And he wants to use those weapons to arm the slaves and then lead them in a revolt throughout the South. They kill off all the slave owners, they get their freedom, and they want them to establish sort of a new slave republic in the area of the mountains of West Virginia. So he and his men, they attack the arsenal at night. They are successful in capturing it, but no slaves joined them. Ironically enough, the first person that they killed in the raid was an African American who was wandering by that they spotted, and they shot him for fear that he was going to raise the alarm on them. Brown and his men are eventually captured by Robert E. Lee, who's going to become famous during the Civil War as the leader of the Confederate Army. He's going to lead U.S. troops. They're going to capture him while they're held up in a firehouse at the arsenal. Brown's going to be put on trial and then executed in December of 1859. This whole John Brown raid at Harper's Ferry plays into all the fears of the Southerners that they're not safe, that there's radical abolitionists that are trying to kill them. In the North, Brown is treated by many as a martyr and a saint. But in the South, he's a villain, he's a traitor. And it's going to further increase the divide between these northern and southern states. Amidst all of this, there's a lot of changing political parties, and a new prominent party is going to rise up. This is the Republican Party. This is the same Republican Party that we have today. It's going to be founded in 1854 by anti-slavery activists, mainly, that are from lots of other parties. And the issue of slavery is going to pull in people from the Democratic Party, from the Whig Party, there's another party called the Know Nothing Party that was a nativist party. It's going to pull in all these people from all these other parties on this big issue. And their resistance to the expansion of slavery, the party itself is kind of divided into two groups. You have the moderate Republicans, who future President Abraham Lincoln would fall into this group. These were Republicans who were okay with keeping slavery where it was. They just didn't want it to expand anywhere new. Then you had the radical Republicans. These are the people with a more extreme view. They want to eliminate slavery altogether. Some of them want to do it gradually. A lot of them want to do it immediately. The Republican Party had some other key issues, though. They wanted higher tariffs to protect American industries, so this was something that got them a lot of approval in the North at the expense of the South. They also wanted a Homestead Act to encourage expansion west. A Homestead Act would be a law that gives people very inexpensive or free land in order to move out west and expand into the new territories. So Abraham Lincoln was from Illinois, but also Stephen Douglas, the senator that we learned about, who was behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He's also from Illinois. And Stephen Douglas is going to get into a dispute with President Buchanan. President Buchanan, we'll learn a little bit more about him in class, but he was incompetent in a lot of ways. One of the things that he did that to a lot of us doesn't make any sense is he kind of blindly supported the pro-slavery constitution that was passed in Kansas. Everybody viewed the Lecompton Constitution as something that was illegitimate, that most of the people that lived in Kansas did not want slavery, but Buchanan wanted to back this pro-slavery fraudulent constitution, and this is something Douglas strongly disagreed with. There were a lot of Republicans that thought, because of this disagreement, that Douglas would be a good person to recruit from the Democratic Party to be a future Republican presidential candidate. The Republicans in his own state, though, kind of disagreed with Douglas's views, and they decided they wanted to challenge his Senate seat, and they're going to unanimously nominate Abraham Lincoln to do this in 1858. And Lincoln viewed popular sovereignty as an unlawful and immoral expansion of slavery into new lands. And he disagreed strongly with the Dred Scott decision, which Douglas himself was kind of ambivalent on, even though the decision itself kind of negates the Kansas-Nebraska Act and popular sovereignty. The two candidates end up holding a series of 7 3-hour debates to discuss their positions on issues, mainly with regards to slavery. And this was kind of an unprecedented thing. And they traveled all around Illinois. Anywhere from 10 to 15,000 people would gather to hear these debates. And you got to keep in mind, this is a time before television, before internet, where the only way you could hear a candidate's views on something would be either to try and read about it in a newspaper or to go and see the person. So thousands of people would gather to see these two politicians debate. These are two guys who are at the top of their game. They're two of the most capable politicians probably of the time. And it's hard to imagine that with no speakers, no microphones, that these two guys would have their debates and all these thousands of people would be gathered around them to listen to them. Now, although Lincoln does not win this election, it ends up being an election where he actually gets more votes, but because of the way their system works in Illinois, Douglas ends up winning the election. His arguments are very persuasive, and it wins him a lot of national attention. One of his more famous quotes from the debate was, "A house divided upon itself cannot stand," which basically is a way of saying slavery is going to end or the union of the states is going to end, but they can't coexist. One has got to go. He argued that popular sovereignty was a way to help slavery expand and that slavery itself was morally wrong, and this is going to help him win over abolitionists. Now, Lincoln himself does not want equality for African Americans. He doesn't even necessarily want them to be able to vote or anything like that. He makes a lot of arguments that he feels like, political power should rest with whites. And he's not one to look and espouse equality between the races. But he is a step in the right direction in that he at least feels like slavery needs to stop its expansion, which is very different from Douglas. So the presidential election of 1860 is going to come around. Nobody wants President Buchanan, who is the Democratic president at the time. He's not going to get the nomination of his own party. He's generally seen as incompetent by just about everybody. And in the middle of this, you have this huge sectionalism that's growing between the North and the South, where these two regions are strongly divided on the issue of slavery. And then you throw in this presidential election into the midst of this, and it's going to be a mess. What's going to happen is you're going to end up having a four-way race for president. Abraham Lincoln, through some savvy political maneuvering, he's going to get the Republican nomination for president. The Democratic Party is going to actually split, where Democrats that live in the North are going to support Douglas as their candidate for president and his popular sovereignty ideas. The Southern Democrats are going to go with a guy named John Breckinridge. That's your strong pro-slavery party. And then you have some more moderates in the South and people that are kind of pulled in from a couple different parties. They're going to form the Constitutional Union Party, and their nominee is going to be a guy named John Bell. Lincoln knows that he is not going to get a single vote in the South, but he realizes the way the Electoral College is going to work, and that he can win the election if he can win all the northern states. So even though he doesn't get a majority of the popular vote, you can see on the chart, he gets 40% of the popular vote. He cleans up in all the really populous northern states, the ones that have lots of electoral votes. He wins those states, the New Yorks, the Pennsylvanias, the Ohios. That ends up giving him 59% of the electoral votes, even though there are lots of other candidates winning other states. Breckinridge wins most of the Deep South. Bell's going to win these border states that are in between. The only state that Douglas is going to win is Missouri. Even though Douglas gets almost 29% of the popular vote, he doesn't win a majority in any states in the North, so he can't win those electoral votes. Lincoln's election really united the states of the Deep South on the need for secessions. The Deep South are the states that are furthest south. The Florida, the South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana. That's the Deep South. Secession would be them withdrawing from the United States and forming their own country. South Carolina was the most outspoken of these states, and South Carolina officially seceded on December 20th, 1860. Within less than 2 months, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all followed suit in that order. They form the Confederate States of America. They draft a new pro-slavery constitution, and they choose Jefferson Davis to be their first president. Lincoln is inaugurated on March 4th in 1861. And when he takes over, Buchanan has just let all of this happen. So while Buchanan has been the lame duck president waiting for his term to end, he lets all these states leave the United States. He lets them start arming themselves, and they start preparing for war. And he just sits by and does nothing. So you have a map in your packet that I want you to label. And one of the benchmarks that you have is you have to be able to identify the division between Union and Confederate states and also the territories. So you can use this map to complete the one that you have. You can just freeze the screen. There's lots of versions of this map on the internet too, and I'll end up posting a copy of this probably where you can pull it up in your Edsby. But just to kind of go through, so South Carolina is here. South Carolina is going to secede first. Then Mississippi, Florida, and Alabama are going to follow suit pretty quickly. Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, there's going to be some debate on whether or not they wanted to secede, but by February, they're going to pull out. These are going to form the initial Confederate states. What's going to end up happening is the shooting is going to start at a place called Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. And Fort Sumter was a small fortification in the middle of the harbor designed to protect the harbor from naval attacks. And what's going to happen is there are going to be federal troops, Union troops, who are holed up in the fort. The South Carolina militia, once the fort, they're going to threaten to attack if the Federals don't give it up. Buchanan doesn't provide them any kind of support or assistance. When the deadline passes, the South Carolina militia attacks. It takes about 2 days. The fort surrenders. Now the actual shooting has started. And when the northern states and the Union and the federal government commit to using force to bringing the Confederate states under control, that's going to be the final straw for these states in the upper South. So at that time, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Virginia are also going to join the Confederacy. Over the course of the war, Virginia is going to split. Virginia at the beginning of the war included all this territory of Virginia and West Virginia. West Virginia is going to end up leaving Virginia and joining as a Union state. We didn't have a whole lot of slavery in West Virginia in the mountains. These states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, these are known as border states. Border states were states that were part of the Union, but they still were states where slavery was legal. And in many cases, these states are pretty much just occupied territory by the Union at the start of the war. Especially Maryland is essential because the capital of Washington, D.C. is sitting right here. And if the federal capital is surrounded by Confederate states, that's kind of a big problem. So Maryland was something that had to be immediately occupied and controlled because there were a lot of people in Maryland who supported the Confederacy. But on your outline map, I want you to kind of recreate, add these states in here. Make sure that you add in the border, the boundary right here between the Confederate states and the Union states. Label all the states. Make sure you know the difference between the border states, Union states, which states entered the Confederacy first and which states entered after Fort Sumter. This concludes our video on the causes of the Civil War.